Welcome here on Adobe live from the Awwwards in Amsterdam. And my next guest, Anrick Bregman, is it's going to be super interesting because it's all going to be about VR and augmented reality and all of these new words that that we start hearing about. So we're one stream away from the end of our awards stream here. So I'm super happy to be here with Anrick for the next 25 minutes. Maybe we will start with like a little introduction from you, like who you are, what you do, and what.
So my name is Anrick. It's super nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm a director. I've been working on immersive storytelling for 10 plus years. So that means really anything where the user or the viewer or the player, those terms all apply, are in some way able to interact with the story. I began working on web-based experiences about 10 years ago. I think the web was a really formidable medium for interactive storytelling.
Can you give me an example of something you worked on 10 years ago? Because probably you would do it completely differently now.
To a degree, yeah. I mean, 10 years ago, I think one of my most favorite projects in terms of the process and in the result, I worked on a project called Attraction. That's almost 10 years ago. That was a project we did in collaboration with Koji Morimoto in Tokyo, who's a really well-known anime director, and Studio 4C, also in Tokyo. So prolific people in that anime space, and we took them on board and collaborated on an interactive anime in the browser using technologies like web-based face tracking, interactive movement in the browser using live reactive animation. So a range of technologies that allow the viewer to become involved in some way. And those technologies or those reactive elements, I think, are really still a part of the way that you could interact simply with stories today. In those days, we were using technologies like Flash. You might build that differently now, but it'd be an example of an early project I was involved with.
Is this still available on the
I don't know, actually. I've not tried that link for quite some time. I mean,
maybe our super moderator, Tim, can find out. He's very good at finding things like this.
Yeah.
So you were here as a speaker as well at the awards. What was your talk about?
So I talked quite a lot about my recent work. I've been transitioning from web into virtual reality, augmented reality the last years, 4 or 5 years. And so I tried to go through that work, but also maybe provide a bigger narrative. One of the things that for me is very interesting that I'm observing a lot right now is that the borders between the virtual and real are disappearing, and you can look at that in a variety of contexts. So you could say that our experiences as humans in the world is becoming shared across different realities increasingly, just like social. That's another part of that same spread of our time. And at the same time, you also look at the technology, and that technology is increasingly becoming connected. Things that might have seemed in the past like places you go to that you disappear into, a VR experience which is isolated, could now, for example, be social and therefore include other people from your real life. And so those two spaces are becoming real spaces you can go with real people and have an adventure. And so that's the theme that sits on top of the work that I do and the work that I aspire to do, is to shrink the borders between the real and the virtual. I'm really interested in how those two are blending and how we can, as human beings, how we can become sort of equally present in both spaces, if you will.
How do you see the adoption of VR versus AR, for example? Which do you think we should focus on more right now, or does it always depend on the story you need to tell?
Yeah, I would probably be attracted to particular stories. I think it depends on your interest as well. I think virtual reality is a fantasy space. Augmented reality is a real layer in the real world, and those two things have very different functions. Of course, you can apply the same storylines in very different ways to both. So, I think it's interesting to see that storytelling being made, being done today, and people exploring those two technologies.
Because I have this feeling that probably augmented reality will be the first step of mass adoption, and then like this sort of notion of things like an overlay of information, like you mentioned, and VR is still something that is really it's a tech that's not highly available to everybody. I mean, you need the device, right? And most of the time you also need some helping devices, like maybe a device where you can walk on, or a touch device, or things like that. So
it's definitely more on the spectacular side. Yeah, I think what would be interesting is the real test. Maybe is with augmented reality, is very possible you might have already used it but didn't realize, or that will happen at some point in the future. And that's, I think, really the test that you could say allows something to scale, is when you're not specifically going out of your way to experience something, and that's definitely something that augmented reality has as a benefit over virtual reality.
Is there a specific part of the talk that maybe you want to share with our viewers, and maybe some concept that is
Sure, yeah,
close to your heart?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about a couple of projects which I think are interesting. I think one of the things that I often work on is pretty open-ended experimentation, and so I'll talk a little bit about.
By the way, they love your website.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, the website is amazing.
Yeah. So I work with about an open-ended experimentation. One project that I worked on recently is a project called Rook. I love two things. I love history, which is often compatible with, but not the obvious connection to futuristic technologies. I'm an equal lover of sci-fi, but history has always been fascinating to me. And so bringing something that for me is historic, a mythological story about a creature of past times, a Loch Ness of the skies, if you will. Bringing that kind of creature to life was an interesting idea, and I've been working on that for quite a while. Rook is the result of that project. And really what we did with Rook is we created a fairy tale using web VR technology. So that means that anybody in the browser can experience it. It's optimized for Google Daydream headsets, but anybody with a screen or with a phone can use it. And we built this fairy tale of this raven, this large creature floating through the air, remembering its own former past. The narrative really doesn't have a message apart from it's a fairy tale, and it's a story of this old creature's former glory. And that was an interesting process. What I mean when I say open-ended experimentation is that I didn't really have the end goal in mind when I began this project. This happens in between a lot of commercial work that I do. I went over to Ireland with a friend of mine who has a 360 drone, and we filmed some nature scenes. We filmed that drone flying through a whole range of spaces. And I began on that trip, it was a pretty impromptu thing to do, and on that trip I began to form an idea of this creature flying through those landscapes. It's just a vision that came to me. It's could have been anything. And so we began to develop this project very naturally as that experience in Ireland took place. And then it took me a couple of years for it to all come together in between other stuff and in between other work. Because what I really wanted to do was create a CGI raven, a proper character that flies inside of this live action 3D environments. So these live action spaces that you explore. So beautiful, empty, desolate Irish landscapes, and then this old creature flying through those spaces and remembering the former glory days, remembering its greatest, most powerful moments. So that's what Rook is about, and you know, it's from a story perspective to me interesting. I remember the story as a kid. I remember being told that story. It made me dream of this scary creature, but also technically, I think it brings layers together that interest me. I have 2 feet, one in the film world and one in the game engine world or in the CGI visual effects world. And there's always been an interesting duality that comes back in my work as well. Is those 2 spaces to me are interesting just purely from a production and process point of view.
And I think that's a super interesting point, because we think of VR as, you know, like mostly gaming these days, and some immersive experience, but more related to gaming. But I think there's so much that can be told in VR, like feelings and storytelling. I think it's a wonderful medium for that sort of thing. Like really like an immersive experience, like you mentioned, like flying around with Rock.
Well, and doing things you haven't done before. You know, and of course, film does that too, and traditional games do that too. I do think sometimes we take the properties of entertainment that already exists and apply it to VR or AR exclusively. I mean, books are potentially the most immersive medium I've ever experienced.
Do you remember? I think it was in '95, maybe. I don't know if you were already active in that time.
Maybe a little bit.
There was an Adobe application called Atmosphere. Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
It was a virtual reality creation tool.
Amazing.
It was amazing, and that was the reason why in my studio I bought a PC. I was a Mac person, but I bought it because it only worked for PC. But the fact is, it only had a couple of versions because the world was not ready
Yeah.
for in '95 to do virtual reality sets and things like that, because you couldn't distribute them correctly, and people didn't know really what to do with them. So just that little fascinating tidbit of history.
Well, it's absolutely true. I mean, it stretches back. We often overlook the learnings from that very first wave of virtual reality, many of which are very valid, and modern day creators in this space really can learn a lot from those early days creators. I mean, there's Jaron Lanier as one of the many obvious examples, and I've met others, but who have experimented in the space in ways that we are experimenting now, with very different, much more bulky and complicated equipment, but still tried similar story-based experiences.
Yeah, Eduardo says VR nowadays is about to fusion with cinema. If you take into consideration soon enough, Anrick vision will be more than reality, will be a requirement.
I think it's true. I mean, I think what's very powerful, one of the things I didn't really have time to dive into, but I've written about it, is the fact that underpinning the real advances in the last years of VR and AR is the advancement in game engine technology. So what Unity and Unreal are doing is rapidly scaling up the power that their software have, or Epic Games for Unreal. And the ability of procedural-based processes or making optimizing as a process a little bit more accessible for indie game developers, or you can talk about a whole range of things, but the point is, Unreal and Unity together are revolutionizing the pipeline of content for these two medium, and they are making it possible for you to create fully realistic spaces that is edging every single day closer to cinematic quality. In my work, I've always worked with a high level of realism. That's why, for example, like for Rook, I could have gone for a low poly approach, an environment that's 3D. It would have given me additional interactive benefits. But I'm definitely someone who has a real fascination with and a love for cinematic, realistic.
Yes, because that's also
visuals.
always in the conversation, right? Is it going to be realistic, or is it going to be, like you said, like a little bit more graphical?
Absolutely.
Like, for example, one acquisition that fascinated me in the past years is Microsoft acquiring Minecraft. And my thought was always, that's actually a very smart acquisition, because if Microsoft wants to go into the VR space, that's the best place to start, because it's already boxy, it's already low poly, and people are expecting that, and it's a perfect world to interact with in a virtual reality environment. But I have no information from Microsoft about that. That's just a personal thought.
I mean, I think it's an incredible piece of software. Minecraft inspires generations, and I think also for parents of young kids, it's a relief to have an experience that their kids genuinely love that isn't violent.
And that
so
gets
that's
them coding.
It gets them to learn, but somehow they just absolutely love it, and so it's really powerful. There's absolutely no more validity to non-lifelike visuals versus abstracted. And there's beautiful experiences that don't have that realistic look. And I think of Journey as an example. There are many.
Journey is,
there's just some magic that inspires people. It's just a personal preference. I love cinema. I love what's happening in game engines where, for example, the qualities and properties of cameras and lenses are being 100% accurately recreated inside of a game engine. And so when we think of the visual language of cinema, we think of a close-up. It isn't just the proximity of the camera, it's the lens that's different. It's the depth of field that lens brings to the shot. It's the way the face is shaped. We don't realize this, but we've seen thousands of movies. And so that language of cinema is imprinted in our brains. And if we can bring that into game engines, it starts to feel less like a flat world that's far away. And it starts to mimic the things that our brain is used to responding to in cinema. And so for me, that is fascinating. And then maybe just as a semi, totally unprofessional amateur landscape photographer, I just love the beauty of landscapes. Like I think there's
and you can learn a lot from it, like like how a landscape evolves with the distance, for example. And like as you mentioned, like in gaming, this is something that, like, I don't know, let's take Red Dead Redemption 2, and and how the game engine actually creates all the layers of fog and distance and things like that. It's things that are coming closer and closer, like you say, to these cinematic effects. And I think the step from this sort of gaming to being immersed by that gaming is really, really close now.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean the complicated argument that is widely discussed in the VR space and beyond that in the 3D space is, of course, that the closer you get to reality, the more likely people will be really thrown by it. Because if you stay very far away from it and you make something beautiful, which is abstract, people aren't trying to question if it's real. But if you get very close to reality but miss, that breaks the immersion more than if you were just living inside of a completely abstracted space. And this is true, but I guess this is the point. Like, I think with tools like Quixel, like mega scans and incredible, beautiful texture packs that are just all prepped, or substance designers, like there's just a whole range of tools now that allow you to make things that feel convincing, where the realism is no longer broken by that uncanny valley. And that to me is exciting. That just happens to be my sort of preference. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing things are that are coming. You have something other open here, Storm.
Yeah, so Storm is another project that I think deals, or at least pleased me in that similar way. Storm is a project I began a few years ago now. It's a virtual reality game. We built that in Unreal Engine, and Storm really tries to take climate change as a theme and turn it into an experience. And so that was one of my first self-made project that began to deal with a theme that I'm very passionate about today. And Storm was the beginning of that. Storm, as a concept, is fairly straightforward. The enemy isn't another person with a gun, but the weather. Extreme weather game. It's a survival game. We made this insane, angry snowstorm. It feels like your skin's being ripped off. Especially sound, I think, there plays a massive role. And you journey through that space. You try to find a way in to anything warm. Anything protected and secluded, and that's the challenge. It's like an inverse escape room. You're outside, and you have to get in to survive or to complete the level. And so that's another project I think that does with the same thing. We began to make visuals that really aren't quite reality, but allow you to dream about that cinematic quality of gaming that I love personally.
Yeah, I think that's a good recipe to because it also. It goes into the realm of illustration and fantasy and expressive feelings in the end, because it's a vision. It's not reality, and I think that's a virtual reality that I kind of prefer, rather than than the perfect, which will never be. Well, not now, but maybe one day.
I think we're taking massive steps. I mean, I think the next step will be super interesting. If I look at companies out there, certainly in the VR space, and again, it's broader for gaming, right? So if I look at Improbable, which are based in London, and are building what is essentially a procedural generative world, and then beyond one world, a universe, imagining traveling to a place that nobody has seen before and no human has created, and going to see what it's like, but with all the power that procedural
this game was this, like, you spawn in a planet and then you can travel to other planets. What was that?
That's another game,
which was meant
No
to be
Man's Sky.
No Man's Sky. Yeah, that's
which
right.
I think is, again, it delivers on a childhood dream for me. It's very funny for me because I read so many sci-fi books as a kid. And a lot of the things that happen in sci-fi books that just really capture my imagination are happening. They're just happening in virtual spaces. It's the only detail that the sci-fi books left out. You know, where you can change your body using augmented reality. You don't have to be a human anymore. Or, for example, I saw an amazing project where you have a virtual tail and you learn how to use that virtual tail, a body part you don't have physically. And Improbable is experimenting with a similar idea as No Man's Sky. So fully procedural worlds. Only they're applying it to a whole range of different games and experiences. So one of the many companies, I think, innovating in that space. And it really makes you dream. I mean, handcrafting Storm as a game is a process of manually placing every rock and every detail. And the dream, I think, is that infinite worlds can be created. You can teleport to some far corner of a virtual space with friends and discover something that no human might have seen before. And, you know, like No Man's Sky, that might include virtual life that you didn't really ever imagine existing. Why? The point of that maybe another matter. Like it's very interesting that those things are becoming possible.
Yeah,
I think as storytellers, then we can begin to add layers of meaning. We can begin to create experiences where we're not obsessed and overwhelmed sometimes by, especially as indie creators. Like Storm was an indie project, really mainly self-funded. So then you become overwhelmed by the process just of creating it and getting over the finish line, as opposed to being able to just expand your imagination and being free from those constraints.
So what's next for you?
So next up, I'm working on another project. I will show you a couple of visuals, which I
just have a couple of minutes left.
Sure. So I've been working on a project that I'm super excited about. And it's really, again, about climate change. I think it's the single most pressing issue. None of the technology advancements we're loving here, that we're discussing here and excited about here, will matter if things go further than they already have in 2018. 2018, I think, was a landmark year for climate change. We saw things happening and are still happening that are truly staggering and that really show us that the warning signs we should have been listening to were right. So my small contribution to that debate, apart from my own personal choices as a human being and in terms of how I consume energy and all that kind of stuff, my personal contribution to that dialogue is a project called Drift, which is about making a connection with somebody who is living in 25 years. Somebody who is not born yet today, and who is living the results of our actions, but also it's a narrative that focuses on the longer-term trends of climate change. Of course, climate change and extreme weather events are day-to-day issues we should be discussing, but the real impressive and frightening impact, and maybe the stories that will create change, I think, are the ones that show us a longer-term trend.
Awesome. Well, Anrick, what can I say? Thank you so much for swinging by our Adobe live stream. We have one more stream with Stephanie and Sander Krombach in just 5 minutes. But I think all these, these thoughts about virtual reality and augmented reality are going to become more and more important. And I just love the work you're doing and the way you're thinking about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Super nice to be here. Thanks,
Stay
everybody.
tuned.